I deliberately don't intend to speak for very long, partly because some of you may be bored of hearing me speak, but also because Charlie's presentation on the work of frontline defenders and how they protect people who really are facing challenges we may find it hard to believe on a day-to-day basis. I want to ensure that we have time for discussion. I'm sure you'll have many questions. So I'll try and keep it to maybe 10 minutes so that we've got time for discussion and questions before the end of the session. As Colin said, I want to talk a bit about refugees and migrants in the broadest sense, but also focusing specifically on the displacement that's arisen from the Syrian conflict and what that then means in relation to what we're seeing in migrants and asylum seekers, refugees crossing the Mediterranean in boats. And it was one of the quotes you have on one of the posters for this event that really stuck in my mind. It's the quote from Nelson Mandela, saying to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. And I think, unfortunately, when we hear the debates around migration, around asylum seekers, and we see what people are perhaps fleeing from, we get a very clear impression that this is a group of people who are very often denied their humanity. Their human rights abuses are somehow allowable because they're just a group, they're migrants, they're people fleeing, asylum seekers, what have you. So I want to focus a bit on the human rights of migrants and to shamelessly use the concept of a front line. I want to talk about Europe and how Europe is currently at the front line of some of the major issues relating to how we respond to displacement. As Colin mentioned, we're seeing displacement at levels which we haven't seen since the Second World War. But it's also important for us to remember that of the two other major displacement events, we have Afghanistan, but we also have the former Yugoslavia. So that's also a European event. So for those of us from Europe who live in Europe, who perhaps think that these things don't happen on our doorsteps, maybe we need to realize that we are the front line. And that maybe doesn't feel so much here in an island in the periphery of Europe, but actually Europe as a whole is at the front line in many of these debates. And the second point I want to maybe perhaps trying to get across is how you guys can be at the front line as well. You don't necessarily need to be in Syria literally on the front line, but how can you be involved in human rights activism, supporting the work of organisations like Frontline Defenders and others. And I know many of you may actually be considering careers in human rights as well. So that's very briefly what I'm wanting to try and get across. And I want to start with a quote from a Human Rights Watch report from 2011, which was looking at the issue of migrants crossing the Mediterranean. And in it says, it's a testament to human courage and tenacity that an Eritrean man survived for days at sea, clinging on to flotsam. It's an outrage he had to. And I think this is really getting those two parts. The strength of individuals, that even after days at sea, someone is still able to continue fighting for life and fighting to ensure that they can continue. But it's also an outrage that someone ends up in that situation on our own doorsteps here in Europe. And I have to admit, I have a personal interest in this as well. My great-grandfather ran away to sea at the age of 14 against the wishes of my great-great-grandparents. And he was shipwrecked in his first voyage. He was crossing the Atlantic, 14-year-old, cabin boy kind of scenario, and he was shipwrecked. But luckily, they were saved. They were able to get to land. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. But as a result, our family has always had a very strong connection to the lifeboats, to the RNLI. And some of my earliest memories from a wee kid are standing with a collecting tin during lifeboat week, asking for money for the lifeboats so that we actually have a service, and the lifeboats is a voluntary service, to go out and save people, protect people who get into distress at sea. We would expect that around our own shores. So how can we think about that when people are fleeing from situations of persecution and war and violence? How can we have, if you like, a Mediterranean, a European lifeboat service? And that's what we really were looking for. I don't think I need to really remind you of the Syrian conflict, I'm sure you are aware of how over the last 3 years we've had just massive death, massive injury, and massive displacement as a result of what started off as an internal conflict within Syria. We had the whole Arab Spring, a whole series of events around the periphery of the Mediterranean. So when I talk about Syria, that's only the most obvious one at the moment. But we now have, it's reckoned, about 9 million people displaced. 9 million Syrians have been displaced in the last 3 years as a result of the fighting. Okay? And that's just Syrians. This isn't even getting into the discussion around ISIS or IS and the displacement that's been caused as a result of that. And of that, about 5.75 million of those 9 million people are being displaced within Syria. So they haven't even been able to cross a border. Maybe they don't want to leave their country, maybe they want to stay close to their area, but they've had to flee because of the fighting. Or maybe they haven't been able to leave. So you have a huge number of people stuck within Syria as it is. But then you also have 3.25 million people who've left Syria in the last 3 years. And we've seen many of them moving into the neighbouring countries. So Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq. And as is always the case with major displacement, it's the neighbouring countries that take up the vast bulk of the people who are displaced. So it's reckoned maybe about 150,000 people, Syrians, have actually managed to make it into Western Europe. Okay? As Colin mentioned, we have this major donor conference. Part of that is hopefully so that countries, Western countries, will be able to actually provide more places for resettlement. Charlie was talking about the need for relocation, protection for human rights defenders. Refugees may need to be actually actively taken to other countries to be provided protection. So we have to take, for very good moral and legal reasons, people who are fleeing the Syrian conflict because they deserve that protection. And we have a call at the moment for £5 billion worth of aid that's required because of the situation in Syria. So the World Food Programme at the beginning of December had to cancel all food distributions because they'd run out of funding. And the only way they were able to restart that food distribution in the last few days was through an online funding campaign that managed to raise £61 million. So WFP went and had an online, these are voluntary donations from people all around the world. Okay, but that's a drop in the ocean in terms of what the funding needs are. So if we think about all that's been going on in Syria and how that's affected the region, it's no surprise that we're now seeing the level of people who are trying to move further afield. If you're in a refugee camp in Lebanon and there's no food being provided because the World Food Programme has got no support available because they don't have the funding, well, do you sit and starve in Lebanon rather than being shot in Syria? I mean, there's stark choices that people are having to make. And so it's not surprising that people have been moving further afield than just the neighbouring countries. But some of the statistics, I think, are pretty shocking. UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, released some figures just a few days ago. And so they're talking about 2014. Okay? So we haven't even got to the end of 2014. The largest number of people that they'd registered fleeing in the Mediterranean in unseaworthy, overcrowded boats previously was in 2011, so during the Libyan conflict. And there's 70,000 people in 2011 who were rescued at sea or identified as fleeing situations of conflict. This year, it was 207,000. So 3 times more people this year, and we haven't even reached the end of the year, have been rescued at sea in the Mediterranean than at the height of the Libyan conflict. Okay? Actually, the Human Rights Watch report I referenced earlier, which was from 2012, talked about it being a hidden emergency. We're 2 years on from that, and I think it's still fairly hidden. I think people don't understand quite the level of movement and distress. Because of the 4,272 migrants who UNHCR have identified as dying at sea this year so far, 3,419 of them have been in the Mediterranean. So that's 80% of all migrant deaths at sea globally have taken place on our doorstep here in Europe, in the Mediterranean. And I think that's a sobering figure. If you think about the vast expanse of the Pacific, the number of people fleeing the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, the issues with Australia. I mean, look at what Australia has been trying to do to interdict boats arriving and all that's happened politically within Australia about that point. And yet 80% of the deaths that are occurring on our doorstep here in Europe. So what I want to do is I want to just finally look at what does this mean? What do we need to do, or what can we do? Okay, so the Italian Navy for the last year in 2013 was running an operation called Mare Nostrum, and they rescued about 100,000 people in 2013 from boats which were overcrowded. And I think they deserve recognition of that. That's partly because there was a European Court of Human Rights decision in 2009 which was extremely critical of the Italian Navy's approach of pushing back migrants. So the Italian government, to be fair, responded to a very negative European Court of Human Rights decision. And so for the last year has been providing rescue at sea services. Obviously not able to rescue everyone, but been doing a pretty good job. The trouble is, at the end of last year, they said, we can't do this anymore by ourselves. Okay, we need this to be a European response, an EU-wide response. And you may have heard in the news fairly recently, unfortunately, the operation that's being put in place by the European Union has been a shadow of what the Italian Navy was doing. And our own government, the British government, has said effectively that they don't support ships going out to try and rescue overcrowded, unseaworthy vessels. Okay? Because the point is that they have argued that it's encouraging more people to come. If we're rescuing people and taking them onto Malta or the island of Lampedusa or onto mainland Italy, that's just encouraging more people to come. So if we don't rescue them, they won't come in the first place. I mean, that's the logic behind the position. I mean, forget about Syria, forget about, Egypt, Libya. So we're facing this situation where we've got 80% of the global migrant deaths by sea. And these are, I mean, let's be honest, these are reported. They're vastly, I'm sure many more people die than we know about. But 80% of the recognised reported cases are on our doorstep. And the response of the European Union has been, okay, let's stop providing support. Have a minimal level of support to actually rescue people at sea. So I want to just finish with another quote from that same Human Rights Watch report. Europe has a responsibility to make sure that preventing deaths at sea is at the heart of a coordinated European-wide approach to boat migration, not a self-serving afterthought to policies focused on preventing arrivals or another manoeuvre of northern states to shift the burden to southern states like Italy and Malta. So we're in a situation where we need to decide what sort of response do we in Europe want to make. These are not simple answers. It's not always clear-cut in terms of, is someone a refugee, are they not a refugee? But if people are dying at sea, to me that's pretty clear-cut. You need to make sure that they're rescued. Thanks.